Are you even paying attention? Cashin Aldridge's voice cut through the low hum of the restaurant, sharp and clipped. He didn't shout. He never had to. His tone alone carried enough weight to make most people wither. The young woman standing before him, her hands trembling around the wine bottle, blinked up at him but said nothing. He sighed, exasperated, as deep red liquid dripped down the edge of the polished oak table. His suit, custom, imported, and worth more than the annual salary of half the people in this room, had taken the worst of the spill. The waitress, wide-eyed and frozen, looked as if she'd just committed a crime. Christ, one of his investors muttered, barely hiding his smirk. Cashin exhaled through his nose, dabbing at the sleeve of his jacket with his napkin. If you can't handle pouring a simple glass of wine, he said, not bothering to lower his voice, perhaps you're in the wrong line of work. Silence stretched across the section of the restaurant where his table sat. Other patrons turned their heads briefly before resuming their conversations. The rich and powerful had little patience for small scandals. The waitress still hadn't spoken. Something about that irked him. Most people either stammered apologies or scrambled to clean up the mess, desperate to avoid his wrath. But she just stood there, gripping the bottle, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Go get someone competent to fix this, Cashin said dismissively, picking up his glass to inspect it. And bring me another drink. Without spilling it this time. Still no response. Then, finally, she set the bottle down. Not carelessly, not hurriedly, just carefully, deliberately. And then she turned and walked away. Cashin stared after her. Something about the back of her, the way her shoulders stiffened, the way her steps faltered for just a fraction of a second, pricked at the edges of his mind. He should have let it go. He had more important things to deal with tonight. But when she disappeared behind the doors leading to the kitchen, a strange discomfort settled in his gut. He'd humiliated plenty of people in his life. None of them had left him feeling like this. He hadn't even seen her face clearly. His business associate, Leon Rowe, leaned back in his chair with an amused look. That was harsh, even for you. She dumped $100 bottle of wine on me, Cashin replied, though he barely heard his own voice. His thoughts had already drifted. She hadn't begged for forgiveness. Hadn't fought back, either. Just walked away. Leon chuckled. You're usually quicker than this, but I'll save you the effort. She's not your type. Cashin ignored him. Minutes passed. Another server came by to replace his drink and clean up the spill. But the waitress, the one who had left without a word, never returned. And the longer she stayed out of sight, the more unsettled he became. By the time Cashin stepped outside into the crisp New York night, the waitress was nowhere to be seen. He'd asked for her name. No one would give it to him. A vague, "she left early," was all the manager offered. Something wasn't right. His driver opened the back door of the sleek Blacktown car, but Cashin hesitated before getting in. His instincts told him to forget it. He had an empire to run, deals to close, a world to control. But something nagged at him, a feeling that, for once, he had missed something important. Something about that woman. He slid into the car and pulled out his phone. I want the name of the waitress who worked my table tonight, he said as soon as the call connected. His assistant, always efficient, didn't ask questions. I'll have it in an hour. Cashin stared out the window as the car pulled into traffic, the city lights flashing past in a blur. He had no idea why he cared, but he did, and that alone was enough to set him on edge. Cashin Aldridge wasn't known for patience. By the time his car pulled into the underground garage of his penthouse, he had already checked his phone twice, expecting his assistant's update. His irritation mounted when he found nothing but unread emails and notifications he didn't care about. His instincts wouldn't let it go. Something about that waitress, the way she had frozen, the way she had refused to acknowledge him, the way she had walked away like she was the one dismissing him, had latched onto his mind like a puzzle with missing pieces. He shrugged out of his ruined jacket, tossing it onto a chair as he crossed the sleek, minimalist space of his penthouse. The floor-to-ceiling windows cast reflections of the city lights across the polished wood floors, but Cashin barely noticed. His phone vibrated. Unknown number. He answered immediately. Talk. His assistant's voice came through, efficient as always. Her name is Isolde Vaughn. Cashin froze. For the first time in years, his mind blanked. He must have misheard. Repeat that. The slight hesitation on the other end of the line was uncharacteristic. The waitress. Her name is Isolde Vaughn. Cashin sat down heavily on the nearest chair, his breath short. The name clawed at something buried deep, something locked away in the past, in a place he had never dared revisit. No, it couldn't be. It had to be a mistake. A coincidence. She disappeared years ago, he said, more to himself than to his assistant. Yes, the voice on the phone confirmed. After the fire, Cashin gripped the edge of the table. The fire. The Vaughn estate had burned to the ground 7 years ago. Everyone assumed Isolde Vaughn and her mother had died in the wreckage. There had been no remains found, no records, nothing but rumors and whispers about what had happened to the Vaughn family. And yet, she's alive, Cashin murmured, the weight of the words sinking in. A sharp exhale, a tangle of emotions he couldn't name. His assistant continued. No official records of her exist after the fire. No employment history, no address, no credit activity. It's like she vanished until recently. A pause. If I hadn't pulled employee files from the restaurant directly, I wouldn't have found her. Cashin's fingers tightened on his phone. 7 years. 7 goddamn years, and she had been under his nose this entire time. You want me to dig deeper? His assistant asked. Cashin's jaw clenched. His mind was already racing ahead, trying to piece together what this meant. A name from the dead. A ghost from the past. No, he said finally. I'll handle it myself. The next night, Cashin Aldridge returned to the restaurant. Not for business. Not for pleasure. For her. But Isolde Vaughn wasn't there. When he requested to speak to the manager, the man, a wiry, middle-aged New Yorker with a tired face, gave him a wary look, clearly aware of who he was. Is there a problem, Mr. Aldridge? Where is she? Cashin asked bluntly. Who? The waitress from my table last night. The manager shifted uncomfortably. She quit. Cashin's patience snapped. What do you mean she quit? The man hesitated, but the weight of Cashin's stare left no room for evasion. She walked out after her shift and didn't come back. Told us not to expect her. Cashin inhaled slowly. She ran. The realization made something coil tight in his chest. She had seen him, recognized him, and fled. Why? 7 years ago, she had vanished without a trace. And now, just as suddenly, she was disappearing again. But this time, Cashin wasn't going to let it happen. He turned on his heel and walked out, his mind already forming a plan. Isolde Vaughn had hidden from him once. She wouldn't do it again. Cashin didn't sleep that night. Instead, he stood in his office, overlooking the city, a whiskey glass untouched in his hand. A single thought looped in his mind, over and over, like a sickness he couldn't shake. She ran from me. That meant she had something to hide. And Cashin Aldridge didn't like mysteries. Cashin Aldridge didn't believe in ghosts. But that didn't change the fact that Isolde Vaughn, the woman he had buried with his past, had just reappeared in his life, and then vanished again before he could confront her. He sat in the back seat of his town car, his fingers drumming against the leather armrest. The city blurred past in neon streaks, but his mind was elsewhere. He had given her one night to come back to work, to show her face again. She hadn't. That was all the confirmation he needed. Pull up her address, he ordered. His assistant, Gabriel, was silent on the other end of the call for a moment. Then, that's the thing, sir. She doesn't have one. Cashin's fingers stilled. Gabriel continued. No official residence under her name. The restaurant paid her wages in cash. No credit cards, no leases, no bank records. A pause. It's like she's a ghost. A slow exhale. That word again. Ghost. Cashin refused to believe it. He had spent years forcing himself to forget Isolde Vaughn, convincing himself that she was nothing but a faded memory. Now she was right there, breathing, existing, and yet, she was nowhere to be found. That wasn't an accident. She didn't want to be found. But Cashin Aldridge had built an empire by finding the unfound. He wasn't about to stop now. 2 hours later, Cashin stepped into a dimly lit bar in Brooklyn, a world away from the polished boardrooms and Michelin-starred restaurants he usually occupied. The air smelled of old wood and whiskey, and the low murmur of conversation hummed beneath a classic rock track playing from a dusty jukebox. He had followed the only lead Gabriel could scrape together, a former co-worker from the restaurant, someone who might know where Isolde had gone. Cashin spotted her immediately, a young woman with dyed blue hair and a wary gaze. She had clearly been warned about men like him. Good. That meant she'd cut the bullshit and give him what he wanted faster. She was mid-sip of her drink when he slid into the seat across from her. Lana Porter. He said her name like a fact, not a question. She eyed him over the rim of her glass. Depends on who's asking. Cashin placed a crisp $100 bill on the table between them. Her expression didn't change, but she set her drink down. I'm not looking for trouble, she said. Then don't lie to me. Cashin replied smoothly. Where is Isolde Vaughn? Lana's reaction was subtle, but Cashin caught it. The flicker of something in her eyes. Fear. He leaned in. I know she worked at the restaurant. I know she quit the second she saw me. His voice dropped lower. I also know she doesn't want to be found. Lana swallowed hard. Then maybe you should take the hint. Cashin didn't blink. Not an option. Lana hesitated, then glanced around the bar as if expecting someone to be listening. She lowered her voice. Look, I don't know much. Isolde doesn't talk about her past. I just know she's been running for a long time. Running from what? Lana shook her head. You think I asked? The way she reacted when she saw you. I don't know what happened between you two, but I've never seen her like that before. She looked like she'd seen the devil himself. Cashin clenched his jaw. So it was personal. She must have told you something, he pressed. Lana sighed, clearly debating whether or not to tell him more. Finally, she relented. She had a place. Nothing permanent. Just somewhere she stayed when she needed to disappear for a while. She scribbled an address onto a napkin and slid it across the table. Cashin took it without hesitation. Whatever you're looking for, Lana murmured as he stood. I don't think you're gonna like what you find. Cashin didn't respond. He was already walking out the door. The address led to a rundown apartment building in Queens. The kind of place where the walls were too thin, the lights flickered, and no one asked questions. Cashin stepped inside, scanning the mailboxes. No name for Isolde Vaughn. Of course not. But he had been in the business world long enough to know that secrets didn't stay buried forever. He climbed the stairs two at a time, stopping at the unit number Lana had given him. A small hesitation. Then he knocked. Silence. He knocked again, harder. Still nothing. With a sharp inhale, he tested the handle. Unlocked. He pushed the door open. The apartment was empty. Not just vacant, abandoned. The air was thick with dust, as if no one had lived there in weeks. There were no personal belongings, no signs of life. Just a worn-out couch, a mattress on the floor, and a single cracked mirror hanging by the door. Cashin took a slow step inside, his gut twisting with unease. She had been here, but she was gone. Again. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration burning beneath his skin. For the second time in 2 days, Isolde Vaughn had slipped through his fingers. But he wasn't done looking. Not even close. Cashin Aldridge had never chased anyone before. People came to him. Investors, CEOs, politicians. They all sought his approval, his money, his power. But here he was, standing in the middle of an abandoned apartment, searching for traces of a woman who clearly wanted nothing to do with him. And that only made him want to find her more. The place smelled of dust and stale air. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he moved through the bare space. It was obvious Isolde Vaughn hadn't been here in a while. But she had been here. A small detail caught his eye, something out of place in the otherwise lifeless room. A single coffee mug sat abandoned on the windowsill, rim stained with dried liquid. Not covered in dust. Recent. She left in a hurry. Cashin clenched his jaw. She had probably bolted the moment she realized he was looking for her. That meant she was watching, waiting, just one step ahead of him. Not for long. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and answered without checking the screen. Talk. You're going to want to hear this. Gabriel's voice carried a rare edge of uncertainty. Cashin exhaled sharply. Did you find her? No, but I found something else. Something weird. A pause. You said she disappeared after the fire, right? Cashin's jaw tightened. 7 years ago. Yeah. Well, I don't think that's the whole story. Cashin didn't like riddles. Get to the point. I dug deeper, Gabriel continued. Pulled some old hospital records. Guess whose name showed up 5 months after the fire? A chill crept down Cashin's spine. No way. Isolde Vaughn. Cashin felt the weight of those words settle in his chest. The official story had always been that she and her mother died in the fire. No records, no sightings, no explanations. But now proof. She had surfaced. Alive. And no one had known. Cashin gritted his teeth. Where? Gabriel hesitated. A hospital outside of Boston. Admitted under a different name, Eastlaw Vance. No ID, no insurance. Only stayed a couple of days. Then, nothing. Vanished again. Cashin turned toward the window, staring at the distant city skyline. She had been hurt. 5 months after the fire, she had reappeared, alone. Where the hell had she been before that? Find out why she was there, Cashin ordered. I want everything. You got it. He ended the call and exhaled slowly. 7 years of silence. Now, within 2 days, cracks were forming in the story. Isolde Vaughn wasn't just hiding. She had been erased. And Cashin intended to figure out who had done it, and why. The next morning, Cashin stepped into his office, already barking orders before his assistant could finish handing him his schedule. I want a team tracking every transaction near that apartment in Queens, he said. Surveillance footage, cab rides, train stations, any movement within the last 72 hours. Gabriel followed closely behind, flipping through a tablet. Already on it. But if she knows we're looking for her, she's not going to make it easy. Cashin wasn't interested in easy. He was interested in answers. Then we stop thinking like we're chasing her, he said coldly, and start thinking like we're tracking someone who doesn't want to be found. Gabriel glanced up. That's what worries me. Cashin met his gaze. What? Gabriel hesitated. People don't disappear like this unless they have a reason. A good one. Cashin knew that. And he had a feeling that Isolde Vaughn's reason was something much bigger than just him. It took 4 hours before Gabriel came back with an update. Boston Hospital records came through. He handed Cashin a file. You're going to want to see this. Cashin flipped it open. His stomach tightened. A police report. Filed under the hospital's records on the same day Isolde Vaughn was admitted. Victim of assault. Cashin's grip on the folder tightened. His pulse pounded. Assault. She had been hurt. He scanned the document for details. But the suspect? Unknown. The case? Closed. A cold, sharp rage twisted inside him. He had spent years hating her for disappearing. And all this time, she had been running from something far worse. Cashin set the file down, his jaw tightening. Find out who did this, he ordered. Gabriel hesitated. Cass, find out who did this. His assistant nodded and left without another word. Cashin exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay in control. But deep inside, something dark and vengeful had awakened. Someone had hurt Isolde Vaughn, and if she wouldn't tell him who, he'd burn the whole damn world down until he found out himself. Cashin Aldridge had built his empire by making problems disappear. This time, the problem wasn't a failed acquisition or a stubborn competitor. It was the 7-year gap in Isolde Vaughn's life, and the shadow of a man who had left her in a hospital, battered and nameless. Gabriel had worked fast. Within hours, Cashin had every document the Boston hospital had on record from the night she had been admitted. Victim of assault. Unknown suspect. No formal charges. Case closed. The words burned in his head like acid. Someone had hurt her and walked away untouched. Cashin wasn't about to let that stand. I have a name. Gabriel's voice broke the silence in Cashin's office, a mixture of caution and grim certainty. Cashin's fingers tightened around the whiskey glass in his hand. He hadn't taken a sip. His patience was razor thin. Say it. Gabriel hesitated. That alone told Cashin he wasn't going to like what he heard. Then, Elias Mercer. The name was like a trigger. A memory Cashin had long since buried surged to the surface, dark and unwanted. Elias Mercer, son of Daniel Mercer, a man Cashin's father had been deeply involved with. A name wrapped in whispers of backroom deals, political favors, and power plays that even Cashin had avoided. But Elias had always been different from his father. Unstable, reckless, dangerous. Cashin's grip on the glass tightened. You're sure? Gabriel nodded, sliding a file across the desk. It took some digging, but it checks out. Elias was in Boston the same month Isolde was admitted. He stayed at a high-end hotel a few blocks from the hospital. Cashin flipped through the papers. Receipts, timestamps, digital traces, pieces of a puzzle forming an ugly picture. The pieces clicked into place. Elias Mercer had been with Isolde Vaughn the night she was hospitalized. The rage simmering beneath Cashin's skin sharpened into something lethal. 7 years ago, he had lost Isolde without an explanation. Now he had won, and he was going to tear it apart. Cashin had always been a man of strategy. This time, he didn't waste time plotting. Within 2 hours, he had Elias Mercer's location. The man had made a home for himself in the shadows of old money, surviving on inheritance and influence. He wasn't powerful on his own, but his last name still carried weight, enough to shield him from consequences. Not this time. Cashin's car pulled up outside a high-rise bar in Tribeca, a place Mercer was known to frequent. He stepped inside, ignoring the dim lighting and the overpriced cocktails. His focus narrowed the second he spotted Elias lounging in a private booth, drink in hand, surrounded by people who laughed a little too hard at his jokes. Cashin crossed the room in measured strides, cutting through the crowd like a knife through silk. The second Elias saw him, his smirk faded. Cashin didn't stop, didn't speak, just grabbed Mercer by the collar and slammed him back against the booth. Glass shattered. A woman gasped. Elias choked on a curse, hands flying up in startled defense. What the hell? Cashin's voice was low. Dangerous. Deadly. What did you do to her? Elias blinked, caught between confusion and dawning fear. What are you talking about? Cashin shoved him harder against the booth, his grip unrelenting. Isolde Vaughn. Boston. 7 years ago. Recognition flickered in Elias's eyes. A mistake. Cashin saw it. Felt it. Knew. You remember. His voice was pure ice. That's unfortunate for you. Elias forced a smirk, but it was weak. You're making a scene, Aldrich. Cashin leaned in. I don't care. Elias swallowed, glancing around. His entourage had scattered, leaving him alone. Cashin didn't give him time to recover. You put her in that hospital, he said, voice cutting like steel. Tell me why, or I swear to God. Elias laughed. A nervous, hollow sound. Jesus, Cashin, you're acting like I killed her. Cashin didn't blink. Elias sighed, adjusting his collar as if that would lessen the tension. She was in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's all. Cashin's patience snapped. He grabbed Elias by the throat, forcing him back against the leather booth. Try again. Elias choked out a curse. Jesus, all right. All right. He coughed, eyes flickering with something closer to real fear now. I didn't know who she was at first. She was just some girl who got mixed up with the wrong people. Cashin's grip didn't loosen. She was trying to find something. Elias wheezed. Kept asking questions. About my father. About yours. I told her to stop. Cashin's blood turned to ice. His father? What did she want to know? Elias gave a weak shrug. Never found out. She was too stubborn for her own good. She wouldn't drop it. So, I made sure she got the message. Cashin went still. He had imagined different scenarios in his head. Mugging, random attack, an accident that had forced her into hiding. But this was deliberate. Elias Mercer had hurt her because she was looking for something that tied back to both of their families. Cashin's vision sharpened. Where is she? Elias gave a weak chuckle. Hell if I know. I figured she was dead. Cashin slammed him against the booth again, harder this time. You'd better hope she's not. Security had noticed them now. A bouncer moved toward them, but Cashin let go before anyone could intervene. Elias sagged in relief, rubbing his throat. Cashin didn't waste another word. He turned and walked away, already calculating his next move. Isolde Vaughn hadn't just disappeared. She had been hunted, and now, Cashin wasn't just looking for her. He was going to find out what she knew and who wanted her gone. Cashin Aldridge wasn't a man prone to hesitation. Yet, as he stepped out of the dimly lit Tribeca bar, the weight of Elias Mercer's words clung to him like smoke. She was asking about my father. About yours. Cashin clenched his jaw, sliding into the back of his car. His mind ran cold calculations as he reached for his phone. 7 years. 7 years since he had last seen Isolde Vaughn. 7 years since she had vanished without a trace. Now he knew why. She had been searching for something, and that search had nearly gotten her killed. His fingers tightened around his phone before he pressed a call through. Gabriel answered on the first ring. Tell me you have something. His assistant exhaled sharply. If by something you mean a list of everything Elias Mercer's father was involved in before he conveniently disappeared, then yeah, I've got something. Cashin leaned back, staring at the city lights bleeding through the car windows. Go on. Gabriel's voice turned measured, cautious. Daniel Mercer's name was tied to several offshore accounts that were shut down around the same time the Vaughn estate burned to the ground. Cashin stilled. That was not a coincidence. Are you saying Mercer was involved in what happened to Isolde's family? I'm saying there's enough smoke to suggest a fire, Gabriel confirmed. But there's more. A name that came up in old communications between Mercer and... He hesitated. Cashin's grip on the phone tightened. And who? Gabriel inhaled. Your father. Cashin's pulse slowed. The world outside the car blurred, his mind shifting gears as the implications sank in. His father, Augustus Aldrich, a man whose power had shaped Cashin's entire life. A man who had always been willing to burn people to the ground if it meant securing control. If he had been involved with Daniel Mercer. Cashin felt the walls closing in. Find out everything, he ordered. And get me someone who can tell me where Isolde Vaughn is hiding. Gabriel hesitated. Cashin, are you sure? Find her. Cashin ended the call. He wasn't waiting anymore. If Isolde was running from something his father had done, something tied to the Mercer family, he needed to know why. More than that, he needed to know if she was in danger. Cashin's search led him to an unlikely source. Ava Langley. She wasn't just a private investigator. She was the best at what she did. Cashin rarely dealt with her, mostly because Ava only took cases on her own terms. Tonight, he wasn't giving her a choice. The meeting took place in a high-end lounge, far removed from the corporate world Cashin usually occupied. The place was discreet, known for its privacy. Ava was already seated when he arrived, nursing a dark cocktail, her sharp eyes studying him over the rim of the glass. Cashin slid into the seat across from her. I need a location. Ava smirked. Straight to business. No small talk. Not in the mood. She set her drink down, tilting her head. I don't usually take retrieval cases. Cashin met her gaze evenly. This isn't a retrieval. It's a protection case. Ava's expression shifted slightly. Who's the target? Isolde Vaughn. Ava's reaction was subtle, but there. The slight raise of an eyebrow. The flicker of something unreadable in her gaze. Cashin knew she recognized the name. You already know who she is, he noted. Ava leaned back, tapping a manicured nail against the table. Everyone in my line of work knows the Vaughn story. The fire. The missing heiress. But if you're looking for her, it means you think she's alive. She is. Ava studied him. And why do you want to find her, Aldrich? Cashin exhaled, resisting the urge to lean forward. Because she's running. And I need to know why. Ava was silent for a moment before finally nodding. All right, I'll find her. Cashin felt something uncoil in his chest. But Ava wasn't done. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. But if she doesn't want to be found, Cashin, you'd better be ready for what you might uncover. Cashin met her gaze without hesitation. I already am. It took 3 days. 3 days of waiting, of poring over everything he knew, of going over old files and pieces of a mystery that was starting to take shape. And then, a call. Cashin answered immediately. Talk. Ava's voice was sharp. She's in Vermont. Off the grid cabin, 2 miles outside a town called Hallow Ridge. Cashin didn't waste time. Within 2 hours, he was on a private jet. He wasn't giving Isolde Vaughn another chance to run. The air in Hallow Ridge was different. Colder. Sharper. The kind of place where people disappeared by choice, where the world felt quieter, heavier. Cashin's car crunched over gravel as he neared the location Ava had sent him. He hadn't told Gabriel where he was going. This wasn't business anymore. This was personal. The cabin was small, hidden between trees that loomed like sentinels. The kind of place that blended into the background, invisible unless you knew what you were looking for. Cashin stepped out of the car, his breath visible in the cold air. He didn't hesitate. He knocked. Silence. Then, a rustling sound inside. Cashin's jaw clenched. He knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. She was in there. He could feel it. Isolde. His voice was calm, controlled. Open the door. More silence. Then, finally, a sound. Footsteps. The door cracked open, just enough for a single pair of wide, familiar eyes to meet his. A storm of emotions passed through them. Shock, fear, anger. Cashin's chest tightened. 7 years. 7 years, and she was still the same. Then, before he could speak, she slammed the door in his face. Cashin exhaled sharply, his jaw clenching. So that was how she wanted to play this. Fine. But this time, he wasn't leaving. This time, Isolde Vaughn was going to tell him the truth. Cashin Aldridge stared at the closed door, his pulse steady, his patience wearing thin. She had slammed it in his face. That was fine. He had waited 7 years for answers. A few more minutes wouldn't change anything. But he wasn't leaving. The cold Vermont air pressed against his back as he exhaled, his breath visible in the crisp night. He could hear movement inside, light steps, quickened breaths. She was pacing, debating. He knocked again, sharper this time. Isolde. Silence. A moment later, Her voice cut through the wooden barrier. I have nothing to say to you, Cashin. Her voice was lower than he remembered, rougher, like time had carved through it, making it sharper, heavier. Cashin leaned against the doorframe, calm but unyielding. Then open the door and tell me to my face. A beat. Then the lock clicked. Slowly, the door cracked open, revealing Isolde Vaughn. Cashin had braced himself for this moment, convinced himself he wouldn't feel anything, but the sight of her hit him like a blade to the chest. She wasn't the girl he remembered. Gone were the soft edges, the warmth in her stare. What stood before him was a woman who had learned how to disappear. She wore a loose sweater, sleeves pulled down over her wrists. Her dark hair was longer, but not styled. There were faint shadows under her eyes, as if sleep had been a luxury she didn't indulge in often. And yet, she was still Isolde Vaughn, still the only person who had ever made him feel like the world was small. She studied him like he was a threat. Cashin had expected anger. Instead, he saw something else. Resignation. She had known this moment would come. Why are you here? She asked, her voice quieter now. Cashin let out a slow breath. You know why. A flicker of something passed over her face. Guilt? Then, she stepped back. Not an invitation. A challenge. Cashin took it. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The cabin was small, barely furnished. No personal touches. Just functional, like she hadn't planned on staying long. Cashin scanned the room, noting the half-packed bag near the door. She was going to leave again. His jaw tightened. You're running, he said, not a question. Isolde crossed her arms, staying near the fireplace like she needed the distance. I don't know what you think you're doing, Cashin, but I don't need saving. He let out a humorless laugh. You think I came here to save you? He took a step closer, his voice dropping. I came here for answers. She met his gaze, but he saw the hesitation. She knew what he was talking about. The fire. Boston. Elias Mercer. The 7 years she had spent disappearing. But she didn't flinch. Didn't look away. You want answers? She said quietly. Then you should have asked me before you left me behind. Cashin stilled. The air between them shifted. You think I left you? His voice was sharper now. You disappeared, Isolde. I woke up one morning, and you were gone. No calls. No messages. No goddamn explanation. Something flickered in her expression. Not anger, pain. You wouldn't have believed me, she said. Cashin took another step closer, crowding her space. Try me. Isolde clenched her jaw. It doesn't matter anymore. The hell it doesn't. She turned away, hands tightening at her sides. I don't owe you anything, Cashin. You owe me the truth, he countered. She laughed under her breath, but it wasn't amused. You don't want the truth, she murmured. You want a version of me that doesn't exist anymore. Cashin exhaled sharply. Then tell me why. She didn't answer. Not at first. Then, finally, she spoke, but the words were different than what he expected. How much do you know? Cashin's gaze darkened. Enough. Her head tilted slightly. Then you know it was never an accident. His pulse slowed. She was talking about the fire. You know who did it. His voice was low. Isolde's fingers curled into her sleeves. I know who covered it up. Cashin felt everything shift at once. Who? She exhaled, then met his gaze. Your father. A single beat of silence. Then, the entire world collapsed. Cashin felt his pulse hammering against his ribs, his body turning rigid. Say that again. Isolde's voice didn't waver. Your father was involved in the cover-up. He knew what happened. He let it happen. Cashin felt the edges of his control splinter. His father, Augustus Aldrich, a man who had built an empire on power, secrecy, and control. A man Cashin had always known was ruthless. But this? No, he would have known. Except, he hadn't. And now, the woman who had vanished because of that truth was standing in front of him, waiting for him to decide what to do with it. Cashin exhaled, trying to recenter himself. What aren't you telling me? He asked, voice controlled. Isolde studied him for a long time. Then, finally, they didn't just try to kill my mother and me. Cashin's breath caught. They were looking for something. Something my father had. His mind raced. What was it? Isolde swallowed. A file. A list of names. People who were involved in something bigger than just our families. Cashin frowned. And where is it now? Isolde hesitated. Then, softly, I have it. Cashin's entire world shifted again. He stared at her, realization crashing over him like a wave. That's why you've been running, he murmured. Isolde met his gaze. It's why they won't let me stop. A long silence stretched between them. Then, Cashin reached for his phone. Isolde's expression darkened. "What are you doing?" His voice was calm. "Calling Gabriel." "Why?" Cashin's gaze hardened. "Because if my father had something to do with this," he clenched his jaw, "then I'm going to burn his empire to the ground." The lights went out. A single gunshot split the silence, sharp and sudden. Cashin moved before he thought, instincts kicking in as he reached for Isolde. His fingers found her wrist, pulling her down, just as the sound of shattering glass erupted from the far side of the cabin. A second shot, this time from outside. They weren't alone. Cashin exhaled through his nose, steadying his breathing, his mind sharpening as adrenaline burned through him. This wasn't a random break-in. This was targeted. They had been found. Isolde shifted beside him, her body tense. He felt the movement of her arm, the solid, controlled grip on the gun in her hands. She wasn't panicking. She was prepared. Cashin turned his head toward her, his voice barely above a whisper. "How many?" Isolde's breathing was steady, but her pulse was fast. He could feel it against his arm. "At least 2, she murmured. "Maybe 3. His jaw tightened. This wasn't just surveillance. This was an extraction. Cashin had spent years dealing with power plays, betrayals, hostile takeovers. He knew how these things worked. Someone wanted to end this tonight. The sound of footsteps, slow, careful, crunched against the frozen ground outside. A shadow moved across the single window, barely visible in the moonlight. Cashin felt something twist inside him. His father's men? Mercers? Someone else entirely? It didn't matter. They weren't getting Isolde. She exhaled through her nose, tilting her head toward him. "You armed?" Cashin let out a humorless breath. "No." She didn't hesitate, pressed the cold steel of her spare pistol into his palm. Their fingers brushed for half a second before he closed his grip around the weapon. Isolde's voice was flat. "Don't miss." Cashin never missed. The first real breach came 10 seconds later. A flash of movement near the doorway. A hard kick against the wood, deliberate, testing. Cashin moved fast, low to the ground, shifting toward the nearest cover. He wasn't reckless enough to fire blindly. This was a game of patience, of control. The door cracked under the next hit. Isolde shifted beside him. "They're trying to corner us." Cashin's mind ran calculations. They were outnumbered, not outmaneuvered. Then, the door gave way. A dark figure moved in, gun raised. Cashin fired first. The shot was clean, precise. The impact sent the man sprawling back, knocking into something behind him. Before the body even hit the floor, Isolde moved. She spun low, firing at the second intruder, who barely had time to react. Her bullet caught him in the shoulder, not fatal, but enough to drop him. Cashin didn't pause. He was already on his feet, crossing the space between them, knocking the man's gun away with a brutal kick. He heard the crunch of bone breaking as the weapon skidded across the floor. The attacker groaned in pain, clutching his arm, but Cashin didn't care. Instead, he grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the nearest wall. "Who sent you?" he demanded, voice lethal. The man choked out a cough, his eyes glazed with pain. He didn't answer. Cashin pressed harder, twisting his wrist, just enough to threaten snapping it completely. Isolde stood beside him, breathing hard, her gun still raised. Cashin's voice dropped. "Talk." The man spat blood onto the floor, letting out a wet, pained laugh. "You're already dead, Aldrich." Cashin's grip tightened. Then, the sound of tires screeching outside. A second later, gunfire erupted from the treeline. Cashin barely had time to react before glass shattered again, a storm of bullets ripping through the side of the cabin. Isolde pulled him down hard. Cashin moved with her, covering their heads as they hit the floor. Someone outside was unloading rounds into the cabin, an assault rifle, judging by the rapid fire. The message was clear. They weren't here to capture. They were here to kill. Cashin and Isolde moved fast. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Cashin grabbed the lockbox, shoving it under his arm as Isolde reloaded her gun with practiced efficiency. The cabin was compromised. They had to move. Cashin glanced toward the back door. "Exit." Isolde's answer was immediate. "Through the treeline. But if they have more men waiting." She didn't need to finish. Cashin already knew. They'd be walking into a trap. Still, better than being shot inside a wooden box. A second round of bullets tore through the front of the cabin. The walls splintered, wood flying in all directions. Cashin clenched his jaw. No time left. Go. Isolde moved first, slipping out through the back door like a ghost. Cashin followed, the cold hitting hard as they broke into the open air. The night stretched around them, dark and endless, the snow-covered ground muffling their footsteps. No gunfire. No shouting. Just silence. That was worse. Cashin didn't stop moving. Didn't look back. Then, he felt it before he saw it. A presence. A shift in the air. A single breath too close. Cashin turned. Fast, gun raised. But the man had already stepped out from the shadows. And he wasn't alone. 4 figures. Armed. Waiting. Isolde stiffened beside him. Shit. Cashin exhaled through his nose, adjusting his grip on the gun. The leader stepped forward. Black coat. Scar along his jaw. His voice was calm, almost bored. "Mr. Aldridge," he said, "you really should have stayed out of this." Cashin's jaw tightened. "You made that difficult." The man smirked. "You have something that doesn't belong to you." Cashin glanced at Isolde. The file. This wasn't just an attack. It was a retrieval mission. They wanted to eliminate loose ends. Cashin rolled his shoulders, muscles coiled tight. If they wanted a fight, he'd give them one. Then, the man's smirk widened. "Your father sends his regards." The words landed like a gunshot to the chest. Cashin didn't blink, didn't react, didn't give them the satisfaction. But inside, something cold and final settled in his bones. His father had ordered this. Not Mercer, not some outside player. Augustus Aldridge. Cashin had been prepared to face a rival. Now he knew the truth. He wasn't fighting against an enemy. He was fighting against his own blood. And for the first time in his life, Cashin Aldridge realized he might not make it out of this alive. Cashin Aldridge had always known power came with a price. But he never thought he'd be paying it with his life, or that the executioner would be someone acting under his father's orders. The man in the black coat, Augustus Aldridge's enforcer, stood a few feet away, gun in hand, watching Cashin and Isolde like they were already corpses. Behind him, 3 more figures remained still, calm, as if this was nothing more than another job to check off a list. Cashin's mind sharpened, his pulse steady. This wasn't just about the file anymore. This was about Augustus Aldridge cleaning house, eliminating loose ends, eliminating his own son. Cashin tilted his head, his voice unnervingly calm. "So that's it. You kill me, kill her, take the file, and my father sleeps easy?" The man gave a slow smile. Something like that. Beside him, Isolde barely moved. But Cashin could feel her tension. She wasn't scared. She was calculating. Waiting. Good. Because Cashin wasn't planning on dying tonight. The enforcer took a slow step forward. "You know, Cashin, I always thought you were smarter than this." Cashin smirked. "And I always thought my father was more creative. Sending a hit squad. A little predictable, don't you think?" The man's smile didn't waver. "You're not as untouchable as you think. Your father understands that. You should too." Cashin's fingers flexed over the gun in his grip. "Let me guess. This ends one of 2 ways." The enforcer raised a brow. "Enlighten me." Cashin's smile was razor-sharp. "I hand over the file, get a bullet in my head. Or I don't hand over the file, and still get a bullet in my head." The enforcer spread his hands. "See? You're smarter than you look." Cashin let out a slow breath. "Buying time. Tell me something," he said, shifting slightly, just enough to put himself between Isolde and the gunman. "Did my father even hesitate? Or was this always the plan?" The man's smirk remained. "You're asking the wrong questions, Aldridge." Cashin's grip tightened. He had his answer. This wasn't a warning. This wasn't leverage. This was elimination. His father had sent these men to end him. And if Cashin didn't act now, they'd succeed. The man sighed, lifting his gun. Nothing personal. Cashin moved first. The first shot went wide. Cashin had already dropped low, yanking Isolde with him as the bullet shattered the branch where his head had been seconds earlier. The night exploded into chaos. Gunfire ripped through the air. The forest turned into a battlefield, dark shadows flashing between trees as Cashin and Isolde moved, fast and precise. Cashin returned fire, a clean shot hitting one of the gunmen in the leg. The man crumpled with a sharp grunt. Isolde's aim was deadly. Her shot found a second attacker's chest, dropping him instantly. 2 left. But Cashin barely had time to register it before a third shot slammed into his shoulder. Pain. Sharp, deep, hot. Cashin stumbled, but didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Isolde was already grabbing him, dragging him behind a tree for cover. How bad? She hissed. Cashin gritted his teeth, pressing his palm against the wound. Could be worse. Blood seeped through his fingers. He ignored it. Isolde exhaled sharply. We need to move. Cashin nodded. They couldn't stay here. They weren't out of this yet. They moved fast, weaving through the trees, gunfire chasing them through the night. Cashin could feel the heat of the wound, but he forced himself to focus. Think. Plan. Execute. A clearing appeared ahead. A narrow road, barely visible through the trees. An opportunity. Cashin grabbed Isolde's arm. Down that path. I have an idea. She didn't hesitate. They sprinted. The last two gunmen were still behind them, but the moment they reached the open space of the road, Cashin stopped. Isolde turned sharply. What are you? Cashin didn't answer. He spun, firing into the darkness, forcing the last two gunmen to break cover. A single set of headlights appeared in the distance. A car. Cashin turned, grabbed Isolde, and ran straight for it. The driver barely had time to react before Cashin stepped into the road, gun raised. The car screeched to a stop. The door flew open, and a familiar voice cursed. Jesus Christ, Aldridge, do you ever do anything quietly? Cashin let out a slow, sharp breath. Gabriel. Relief was a foreign emotion. Cashin barely recognized it. But at that moment, it hit hard. Drive, he ordered. Gabriel didn't argue. Isolde jumped into the back seat as Cashin slid in beside her, barely closing the door before the car peeled away from the ambush site. Gunfire exploded behind them, bullets slamming into the side of the car, but missing their mark. And then, darkness swallowed them whole. The silence in the car was thick. Gabriel kept one hand on the wheel, the other gripping a gun. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. You want to tell me why the hell I just had to pull you out of an assassination attempt? Cashin exhaled, pressing his hand harder against his shoulder wound. Long story. Gabriel's jaw clenched. You're bleeding all over my seats. You don't have time for long stories. Cashin ignored the pain, tilting his head toward Isolde. You good? She nodded, her face unreadable. Gabriel let out a harsh breath. Where the hell do you want me to take you? Cashin's mind sharpened. They had the file. They had proof of the conspiracy. And now, Augustus Aldridge knew Cashin was standing against him. There was only one move left to make. Cashin lifted his gaze. Take us to New York. Gabriel frowned. Are you insane? That's exactly where they'll expect you to go. Cashin's expression hardened. Exactly. Gabriel cursed under his breath, but didn't argue. As the car sped through the empty backroads, Cashin turned to Isolde. Time to burn my father's empire to the ground. Her lips curled into something sharp. About damn time. The car sped down the dark highway, cutting through the night like a blade. Cashin sat in the back seat, his fingers pressing against the wound in his shoulder, but he barely felt the pain anymore. His mind was already ahead. In New York, in the empire his father had built, in the reckoning that was coming. Beside him, Isolde remained quiet, her face unreadable as the lights from passing street lamps flickered across her features. She was staring straight ahead, but Cashin knew she wasn't seeing the road. She was seeing the past, the fire, the betrayal, the years of running that had led to this moment. Cashin wanted to say something, but what was there to say? Everything was already set in motion. There was no turning back. Gabriel's grip tightened on the wheel, his voice cutting through the silence. This plan of yours, please tell me it's not just waltzing into the Aldridge Tower and demanding your father's head on a platter. Cashin exhaled through his nose. It's not. Gabriel glanced at him in the rearview mirror. Then what is it? Cashin looked down at the file in his lap, the list of names, the network of power, the evidence that had cost so many lives. We don't just take down my father, he said. We take down everyone. Gabriel let out a low whistle. Jesus, you really are trying to get yourself killed. Cashin didn't flinch. If I don't do this, someone else will. Gabriel shook his head, but didn't argue. You know this means war, right? Cashin's lips curled into a sharp, humorless smile. It was always war. New York City, 4:32 a.m. The car pulled into an underground garage beneath a safe house, one of Cashin's private properties, untouched by Aldridge Holdings. They couldn't risk going to any of his known residences. His father's people would be watching. Gabriel killed the engine. We need to get that wound clean before you bleed out all over my damn seats. Cashin ignored him. His focus was on Isolde, who hadn't moved since they arrived. He turned to face her. Are you ready for this? She didn't look at him. She just reached for the file, gripping it like it was the only thing keeping her standing. I've been ready for 7 years. Cashin nodded once, then pushed the door open. The war had officially begun. The plan. Inside the safe house, the tension was thick. Cashin sat at the head of a sleek black table, his shoulder hastily wrapped in bandages. Isolde leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, while Gabriel pulled up encrypted files on a tablet. "This is the situation," Cashin said, his voice sharp, measured. "We have the file. We have the proof. But we're not the only ones who know it exists. My father's people won't stop until we're eliminated." Gabriel leaned back in his chair. "So what's the play? We leak it. Give it to the press." Cashin shook his head. "Not yet." Gabriel frowned. "Why not? You don't actually think you can confront your father and—" "I can," Cashin interrupted. "And I will." Gabriel swore under his breath. "I don't get it. Why the hell would you walk right into his hands?" Cashin leaned forward, his fingers drumming against the table. He wasn't walking into a trap. He was setting one. "If I leak this file now, my father spins it. He blames Mercer. He blames me. He buries it under 1,000 legal distractions. And when the dust settles, nothing changes." Gabriel exhaled sharply, but he knew Cashin was right. Aldrich Holdings was a machine, a well-oiled empire of corruption and power. It wouldn't fall from one document alone. It needed a collapse from within. Cashin's voice was cold. "Final. I need to make him confess." Silence. Then, Isolde pushed off the wall, her eyes narrowing. "That's a suicide mission." Cashin met her gaze. "Not if we do it right." Gabriel pinched the bridge of his nose. "All right. Fine. Let's say you walk into Aldrich Tower and somehow, get your father to spill all his dirty secrets. What then?" Cashin's smirk was sharp. "Then the whole world watches as he burns." Aldrich Tower, the setup. Cashin Aldrich had walked into his father's office 1,000 times before, but never like this. Never as the enemy. He stepped off the private elevator, his presence immediately noticed by the security stationed at the entrance. The guard stiffened. They had been expecting him. Cashin kept his stride even, calm. "Tell my father I'm here." One of the men hesitated before pressing a comms device to his ear. A moment later, he gave a stiff nod. "Go ahead." Cashin stepped through the doors, into the lion's den. Augustus Aldrich was already waiting. The office was exactly as Cashin remembered, cold, imposing, a fortress of glass and steel high above the city. His father sat behind his desk, composed as ever. If he was surprised to see Cashin, he didn't show it. "Son." His voice was smooth, controlled. "Dangerous." Cashin didn't sit. He didn't have time for games. "You sent men to kill me." Augustus's lips curled slightly. "And yet, here you are." Cashin tossed the file onto the desk. "I know everything." His father barely glanced at it. "Do you?" Cashin's hands clenched at his sides. "You ordered the Vaughns to be eliminated. You covered up a conspiracy that spans across corporations, governments." Augustus let out a low chuckle. "And?" Cashin stilled. His father leaned forward, amused. "Do you really think exposing this will stop anything?" Cashin's jaw tightened. Augustus sighed, shaking his head. "You still don't understand power, do you?" He gestured to the file. "This? It's a footnote. A minor inconvenience. Nothing changes." Cashin met his father's gaze, calculating. Then he pulled out his phone, turned it around, and pressed play. The live broadcast was already streaming. Cashin watched as the color drained from Augustus's face. Millions of people were already watching, hearing his words, hearing him admit everything. Cashin's smile was cold. "You're right, father." He pocketed his phone. "Power doesn't fall with a single file." His voice lowered. "But it burns when the whole world is watching." His father's expression darkened. For the first time in Cashin's life, Augustus Aldrich looked afraid. And Cashin was just getting started. Augustus Aldrich had spent decades perfecting control, mastering power, bending the world to his will. But for the first time, that power was slipping through his fingers, unraveling in front of him. Cashin saw it. The flicker of fury behind his father's eyes. The sharp inhale as realization set in. He wasn't untouchable anymore. He had lost. And worst of all, he had lost to his own son. Cashin stood in front of the massive desk, his phone still streaming live. Millions of people watching the downfall of the man they once feared. His father's lips curled, but there was no amusement in his expression. Only something darker. "You think you've won?" Cashin met his gaze, unwavering. Haven't I? Augustus leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose like a man who had just been dealt an inconvenience rather than a fatal blow. His confidence didn't waver, his voice smooth. Do you really believe this will change anything? That the world will care? He gestured toward the file, the proof of years of corruption, a web of power that stretched farther than anyone had realized. People don't want justice, Cashin. They want order. And the moment you take me down, the moment you expose all of this, you will have created a void. Do you think chaos will make you a better man than me? Cashin inhaled slowly, his jaw tightening, his grip steady. He had spent years watching his father manipulate the world, spin every situation in his favor. But this wasn't like before. This wasn't something Augustus could buy his way out of, twist into his advantage. Because Cashin wasn't afraid of the chaos. He was ready to burn it all down. The difference between us, Cashin said, voice cold, is that I don't need control to win. His father's face darkened. But before he could respond, the doors burst open. Security, armed and moving fast. Cashin barely turned his head, already knowing this was his father's final play. Then another voice cut through the tension. Drop your weapons. Federal agents flooded into the office, guns raised, orders shouted. The moment stretched in slow motion. Cashin barely breathed as they moved around him, their focus on the real target, Augustus Aldrich. His father remained seated, unmoving, his face unreadable as the lead agent approached. Augustus Aldrich, you're under arrest for conspiracy, financial crimes, and obstruction of justice. Cashin watched, waiting for some last-minute maneuver, some desperate attempt at escape. But for the first time in his life, Augustus had no moves left. His expression remained blank as they pulled him from his chair, securing his hands behind his back. Even in cuffs, he held himself like a king. The agent glanced at Cashin. You did good, Mr. Aldrich. Cashin didn't feel good. He didn't feel anything. He turned to his father one last time, watching as the weight of his own empire finally crushed him. And then he walked away. Outside, the city was alive with the fallout. News crews scrambled, people whispered. The world shifted as the empire of Augustus Aldrich collapsed in real time. Cashin barely registered any of it. He had spent so long chasing this moment, preparing for it, imagining it. Now that it was here, all he felt was a strange, hollow quiet inside him. Then he saw her. Isolde stood near the car, watching him, arms crossed, expression unreadable. The moment their eyes met, something passed between them. A recognition, a question, a quiet understanding. He walked toward her, feeling the weight of the past 7 years settle into his bones. It's done, he said. She studied him carefully. Is it? Cashin let out a sharp breath. It will be. She didn't answer right away. Then, softer, are you okay? He exhaled, running a hand over his face. I don't know. A small nod. Good. His brows furrowed. Good. She held his gaze. Because if you knew, it would mean you hadn't lost anything. Cashin stilled. Because she was right. His father was gone. The empire he had spent his life building was turning to ash. For the first time in his life, he didn't know who he was supposed to be. And yet, standing here, looking at her, he realized it didn't matter. Whatever came next, he wouldn't be facing it alone. Cashin Aldrich had spent his entire life chasing things he thought mattered. Power, control, victory. But standing there, watching the remnants of his father's empire burn in the court of public opinion, he realized none of it had ever truly belonged to him. Now he was free, and he had no idea what to do with it. The days after Augustus Aldrich's arrest were a blur of legal proceedings, headlines, and the slow, inevitable unraveling of everything Cashin had once known. The world had turned its eyes to the scandal. Investigations stretching into powerful institutions, names being dragged into the fire one by one. Aldrich Holdings was under full-scale federal scrutiny, its stock in freefall, its board of directors scrambling to distance themselves from the man they had once worshipped. Cashin hadn't gone back to the office. He hadn't answered calls from lawyers, associates, people begging him to salvage what he could, because he didn't want it anymore. For the first time in his life, he wasn't going to fight for something that should have died long ago. Instead, he stayed in the safe house, waiting, not for the world to burn, but for her. The night air was thick with the weight of the city, heavy with the remnants of everything that had come before it. Cashin stood by the window, whiskey glass untouched in his hand, watching as New York moved on like it always did. The empire of Augustus Aldrich had crumbled, but the world hadn't stopped. It never did. A quiet creak of the door behind him made him turn. Isolde. She didn't speak at first, just stood there, arms crossed over her chest, her expression carefully unreadable. But Cashin saw through it now. He saw her, past the walls, past the distance she had spent 7 years building. He set the glass down, exhaling. You're still here. Isolde arched a brow. You sound surprised. He met her gaze. I am. A beat of silence. Then, softer, I thought you'd leave. Her lips pressed together, but not in frustration. More like she was thinking, deciding. Finally, she sighed, stepping further into the room. I thought about it. Cashin let out a humorless breath. I figured. She watched him carefully. And what about you? What about me? You spent your whole life in a war you didn't ask for. Now it's over. She tilted her head. What happens to you now? Cashin let the words settle. Because she was right. For as long as he could remember, his life had been a battlefield. Every choice, every step, every breath had been calculated toward a single goal, winning. And now that his father was behind bars and the empire was turning to ash, there was nothing left to fight for. Nothing except her. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle into his bones. I don't know. For a long time, Isolde didn't respond. Then, quietly, she said, That's a start. Cashin looked at her, something shifting in his chest. She was right again. For the first time, he wasn't chasing something, wasn't fighting against something. He was just here, and she was still standing in front of him. That had to mean something. He took a slow step closer, watching her, waiting for her to pull away. She didn't. Instead, she held his gaze, her breath steady, like she was waiting for him to ask her to stay. So he did. Stay. A single word. Nothing more. No grand speeches, no dramatic declarations. Just a choice. She searched his face, something unreadable flickering in her expression. Then, after a long moment, she exhaled, shaking her head with the faintest ghost of a smile. I was always going to. Cashin let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. And for the first time in 7 years, he knew. Whatever came next, they would face it together.